When I was young, I used to watch a lot of classic movies with my family. And I'm talking about stuff from like the 30s all the way up to the 60s. There was something always, especially the old black and white ones, that just really jumped out at me. You know, the lighting was amazing, the shadows, especially those old noir films that had like the really cool, detective lighting. Man, those were some of my favorite movies to watch. And then I loved watching films like Psycho. There was just a certain look about that film that, you had seen black and white in other films of the time and before that, but there's something about the cinematography and the lighting of Psycho it's a little different. If you go back and look at it, it's not quite as clean. It's a black and white film, don't get me wrong, but it almost seems like the shadows are a little muddied. It's not crisp and clean or anything like that. And the grain, pops out in a certain way that it almost seems like a character in itself. And of course, I love the color films like Hammer Studios. You had Dracula, you had Horror Dracula in 1958 with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. It was one of my favorite movies of all time. I don't care how cheap the effects are or anything. The ambiance of that film it's amazing. And I love it so much. But as I got older and more into photography and filmmaking, I wanted to learn how to recreate those styles or evoke that same emotion that I felt when I was watching those movies. And interestingly enough, before I really got into photography, I was really into filmmaking. So I really studied cinematography, how to compose a frame that, tells the story, a narrative that you're wanting to tell before I learned photography, I can't remember who said it, but I was watching a YouTube video and they were basically saying that, you can look at a single picture as, it's almost its own movie. You have the foreground, you have the midground, then you have the background. And in between all three of those spaces, you have a story, and people love stories. And so when I started thinking about photography that way, I just fell in love and I wanted to create, my own little short stories with images. And something that came to mind was the feeling that I had watching those older movies with my family and how much I love them and how even, 15 years on, they still stick with me, those same emotions, those same memories. I can remember exactly watching certain movies, certain places in time with certain people, even though this happened 15, 16 years ago. So that's one of the reasons I really got into film photography, because especially 35 millimeter film, you're shooting on basically the same format, sometimes the same stocks that they were using back in the day. And that's why one of my favorite films to shoot on is Kodak Double-X. Kodak Double-X is based off Super X, which were Super XX, which was, 1940s, I think, is when it came out. And it was used in a lot of newsreels, photos, stuff like that. I could do a full video on the history of that alone. But the current emulsion of Kodak Double-X came to be in 1959. And from everything I've read so far, it hasn't changed much since then, which is really freaking cool. Some films that were shot on it were some of Alfred Hitchcock's black and white movies. Psycho is the big one that I pull from. It was shot on Double-X. I think Raging Bull was shot on Double-X. The black and white intro scene to Casino Royale, which is very beautiful, is shot on it. And then one of my favorite films in the last 10 years was shot on it, and that's The Lighthouse. Now, I do plan on doing a breakdown of the cinematography with the film of The Lighthouse and explain why it's using Kodak Double-X, but why it's slightly different. I mean, do that. But it is slightly different. I'll get to that in another video. But when I learned that I could purchase, Double-X, I was over the moon. And I remember when I got my very first roll, I think it was the second roll I ever shot. The first roll I ever shot was Visions 3 500T, which didn't go well at all. It went absolutely horrible. But Double-X, I remember loading it up for the very first time in my Pentax K1000. I'd only had the camera about 3 weeks at this point, and I slapped on, I think it was a 50 millimeter lens. Original Pentax one is what I was using. But I remember looking at screen grabs and quick clips of some classic movies shot on Double-X, and I was studying them. How can I recreate the same lighting, the same, atmosphere and emotion that these movies have in my own backyard or some of the places I travel to? And you see some of the photos that I took on screen. I really like how it turned out, but something that became very apparent to me was it also matters what it's developed in. Now, the roll of Double-X that I shot first was developed at a local film lab that specializes in black and white. They do hand processing. They do a really good job. But to my knowledge, they developed in D76, which is a really good developer. It's very, very good. It's, kind of the tried and true classic. But I noticed that other people with different developers were getting different looks, and there were some developers I liked better, some developers I didn't like as much. So that opened a whole new can of worms, and a whole lot of different research. And then I got to do like a quick historical study on what developers did they used to use, how close can I recreate those exact looks, and I'll admit I'm a perfectionist. I'm a really bad perfectionist. But this next few rolls I actually developed in Cinestill's DF96 monobath, which was kind of my foray into film developing, and it worked. I got some good results, but monobaths, they're good for starters who are learning how to control temperature, do times, and handle film and load film into, in total darkness. But in terms of full-on quality, I don't think I'll ever use the monobath ever again. I'm not to say that, at a point you outgrow it, but I do think there are certain things you can outgrow. I have seen people, professional photographers use the monobath and get amazing results. It might come down to scanning. I don't know. But now what was I going to say? Moments. But I did research, and it turns out you're supposed to develop Kodak Double-X with D96 from Kodak, which is a motion picture developer used in, old black and white film, 16 millimeter film, stuff like that. It's got a long history, almost as old as Double-X itself. And so the last few rolls that I've shot, I've actually developed in D96. At the time of recording this video, I've shot and developed Kodak Double-X on it from a Pan 100 and FP4 Plus on it, which is 125. And I'm pretty happy with them all. The FP4 could have been just a little bit better, but it was my first time shooting that film, so I probably screwed it up. But when I developed that first roll of Double-X in D96 and I saw the results and I scanned them, it was almost like everything that I tried to achieve, with film photography with Double-X, I had finally done it. With the monobath, I got some great images. I got some stuff I'm very, very proud of, and I learned a lot, but nothing quite clicked the way it did when I saw the negatives from D96. And it was also my very first roll that I'd ever developed, with a traditional, 3-step process. So I was very happy every photo turned out. I was really worried it wouldn't. But the way that the highlights, come back a little bit, that is something about Double-X you have to understand is you get good shadow detail for the most part. You get good contrast, but it kind of kills the highlights. So I've seen a lot of people say, you either get perfectly exposed highlights or perfectly exposed midtones and good shadows. It's never all three at once. I've tried many times, trust me. But it is a beautiful looking film. And if you want that classic 1950s to early 1960s film look, I think this is the best film to use. Kodak Tri-X is really good for this too. I just haven't, experimented enough with Tri-X. I've only shot it twice, and both rolls I accidentally reticulated. So, I'm going to hold judgment on Tri-X for now. But yeah, Kodak Double-X is so beautiful, especially for portraits. I really like the way that it's sharp, but it's not like, way too sharp where it looks like digital. I consider a really sharp film something like Ilford Delta 100. That's an insanely sharp film. And if you get the exposure right, you get the development just right, it can look like digital. You almost have to, create grain in post-processing to make it look like film. It's that clean, which I love Delta 100. But I think Kodak Double-X is that perfect blend. If you want those vintage tones, you want a good, sharp image, but you also want to show people, hey, this is film. It has grain. It has imperfections. In my opinion, Kodak Double-X is the best film for this. Now, eventually in my filmmaking career, I would really, really like to shoot on like 16 millimeter film because Kodak sells Double-X and 16 millimeter film. I would love to do motion picture with it, but Yeah, for now, I've got, I think, about 3 rolls in my fridge of Kodak Double-X, and I'm probably going to order more once some of my suppliers get them in stock. But I just wanted to get on here for a little bit, talk about why Kodak Double-X is my favorite film stock, and while I'll probably shoot with it forever, honestly. But what are your thoughts on Kodak Double-X, and what is another film that you would recommend if you're trying to recreate those vintage tones, vintage 1950s, 60s black and white film look? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But I'm Jake from Jake Fife Photography. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Also, leave a comment if you enjoy the video. It helps the algorithm, then lets me know if I need to change anything, if I'm doing well. And then don't forget to subscribe. But I hope you all have a great rest of your day and keep on shooting.